They didn't just push her, they threw her. Her body hit the snow-covered ledge with a sickening thud, and for a second the world went white. Her boots, worn thin from a life she never asked for, found no purchase on the slick ice. Her knees scraped raw against the frozen ground, and the sharp, biting pain was a distant echo compared to the cold that was already sinking into her bones. Her arms were bound tight behind her back. The leather reins that once guided a tired old mare now served as her shackles. This was it. This was the end. Maeve's breath came in ragged, shallow bursts. It wasn't fear that stole the air from her lungs, not really. It was the cold, an ancient, predatory cold that wrapped around her ribs and squeezed, a merciless vice intent on crushing the very life from her. She was a guest in a kingdom of ice, and it was not a welcoming place. Behind her, her own flesh and blood, her brothers, were silent. Jonas, the oldest, the one whose hand was still sore from dragging her out of their father's house by her braid, said nothing. His face was a mask of stone, carved from the same unforgiving rock as the mountain they stood upon. Cole, the younger one, the one who used to bring her wildflowers and tell her secrets, wouldn't even look at her. He hadn't met her eyes once since she'd whispered the truth to them, the truth that she was carrying a child. His shame was a wall between them, thicker than any winter storm. Jonas finally broke the silence, his voice a low, gravelly sneer. He snatched the thin wool shawl from her shoulders, the last bit of warmth she had, and tossed it into the snow like a piece of trash. "This is Indian country now," he muttered, the words like poison on the wind. "Let him have you." And with that, they turned. No final glance, no flicker of remorse. They mounted their horses and melted back into the dense, dark pines, their figures swallowed by the swirling snow until they were nothing more than ghosts. They had erased her from their lives as easily as a boot print in a blizzard. The silence they left behind was deafening. It was a living, breathing thing, filled with the howl of the wind and the crackle of the ice beneath her. Far off, beyond the ridge, something shifted in the trees, a heavy, patient sound. Maeve let herself collapse fully into the snow, the fight draining out of her. A sharp cramp seized her belly, a stark reminder of the tiny, innocent life she was failing to protect. Her lips, already turning blue, formed a name, a secret she had held close to her heart, a name she had not yet dared to speak aloud. Elias. She didn't scream for her brothers. She didn't beg the empty, gray sky for mercy. She just lay there, a broken thing on a frozen altar, waiting for the cold to claim her. The sky began to bleed, streaks of pale, bloody orange painting the horizon as the sun gave up its own ghost. And that's when she heard it. It started as a low rumble, a vibration she felt in her teeth, before her ears registered the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was a growl, deep, guttural, and impossibly close. One shape emerged from the blizzard first, a phantom of gray and white, massive and powerful, its eyes glowing with a light that was not natural, not animal. They burned like twin coals in the gloom. Then another appeared, and another, a full pack of wolves emerging from the storm like specters. They were the mountain's true sons, and she was trespassing in their hall. Maeve's heart, which she thought had frozen solid, suddenly slammed against her ribs like a trapped bird. This was a death she hadn't considered. Not the slow, quiet fade into white, but the hot, tearing violence of fang and claw. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the inevitable pain, for the teeth that would end it all in a brutal, merciful rush. But the attack never came. She risked a peek. The wolves weren't lunging. They were circling her, not with the frenzied energy of a hunt, but with a slow, deliberate, almost ceremonial grace. They moved like sentinels, like guardians taking up their ancient posts. The largest one, the gray alpha with the burning eyes, broke from the circle. It padded silently toward her, its massive paws barely making a sound in the deep snow. It came so close she could feel the heat radiating from its body, could smell the scent of pine and wildness on its fur. And then it did something that shattered her understanding of the world. It bent its head, and with surprising gentleness, it dropped something beside her. Her shawl. Maeve stared at it, her mind reeling. It was the shawl Jonas had thrown away. But it wasn't cold and wet. It was dry. It was warm. It was impossibly, miraculously warm, as if it had just been taken from a hearth. The wolf took a step back, sat on its haunches, and tilted its great head back. It let out a single mournful howl, a call that sliced through the storm and echoed off the distant peaks, a summons sent into the heart of something ancient and listening. For the first time since her brothers had betrayed her, Maeve wept. She turned her face into the impossible warmth of the shawl and let the hot, stinging tears fall. It was through the fog of her sobs that she heard the new sound. Slow, heavy steps crunching through the snow. Steady, deliberate, human. A figure emerged from between the trees, a silhouette against the dying light. He was tall, broad, and cloaked in thick furs, flanked by two more of the massive wolves. The storm obscured his face, but his voice, when it came, was as deep and steady as the mountain itself. She's still breathing. The great gray wolf, the one who had brought her the shawl, moved aside as if granting an audience. Maeve tried to push herself up, to face this impossible man, but her limbs were frozen and useless. He knelt beside her in the snow, his movements unhurried. His eyes, the color of winter twilight, scanned her face, and with a surprisingly gentle touch, one gloved hand brushed the frost from her eyelashes. "You don't belong here," he said, and his tone wasn't unkind. It was a simple statement of fact. "But then again," he added, a strange, sad smile touching his lips, "neither do I." She tried to speak, to ask who he was, what was happening, but her throat was a knot of ice and terror. All she could do was stare into the eyes of the man who commanded wolves. The pack didn't leave. They didn't growl. They simply waited, a silent gray wall against the storm. And somehow, in the deepest, most primal part of her soul, Maeve knew. He hadn't just found her. He had sent them first. The first thing she noticed was the smell. Pine smoke, rich and earthy, and underneath it, the savory aroma of something simmering, something that promised warmth and life. Maeve's eyes fluttered open. Her fingers, which had been brittle claws of ice, were tingling with the painful fire of returning circulation. Her arms were free, though the raw, red marks from the leather reins were a stark testament to her ordeal. She wasn't lying in the snow. She was covered in furs, not a blanket, but the thick, bristly hide of a wolf. It was heavy and smelled of the wild, and it was the warmest thing she had ever felt. She was on a bed of fragrant evergreen boughs inside a small, rough-hewn shelter, built not on the ground, but into the cliffside itself. It was a cave, but it was also a home. Wind hissed through invisible cracks in the stone walls, but its icy fingers couldn't reach her. Slowly, carefully, she sat up. The movement sent a wave of dizziness through her, but it passed. And then she saw them. 4 wolves, curled in a perfect semicircle near the entrance, their bodies forming a living barrier against the storm. One of them, the great gray alpha, lifted his head as she moved. His intelligent eyes, the color of molten amber in the firelight, locked onto hers. It was a gaze so steady, so knowing, it felt as if he could see every thought, every fear, every secret she held. Then she saw the man. He stood with his back to her, stirring a pot that hung over a crackling fire. He was broad-shouldered, his frame powerful beneath a coat of stitched hides. His dark hair was long, streaked with gray like frost, and tied back with a leather thong. When he finally turned, his face was lean and weathered. etched with lines of hardship and marked by a thin white scar that cut across one eyebrow. But his eyes were calm, steady as a stone. "Didn't think you'd make it through the night," he said, his voice a low rumble. He didn't sound surprised, just matter of fact. He ladled a steaming broth into a carved wooden cup. "You're lucky the pack reached you first. I was 2 ridges over when they called." Maeve found her voice, though it was a dry, cracked whisper, like bark peeling from a dead tree. Who are you?" He handed her the cup, his calloused fingers brushing against hers. He sat on a stool across from her, his movements calm and grounded in a way that soothed her frayed nerves. "Calder," he said simply. "I trap the upper passes. Don't keep much company with folks." His gaze was unnervingly perceptive. It didn't linger on the purple bruises blooming on her arms or the rip in her dress where Jonas had grabbed her. But she knew he missed nothing. He saw all of it. "They left me to die," she whispered, the words tasting like ash. "My own brothers." Calder didn't ask who they were. He didn't ask why. He just glanced toward the gray wolf by the door. "Bram wouldn't have let that happen," he said, as if it were the most obvious thing in the world. Maeve took a sip of the broth. It was rich with meat and wild herbs, and it sent a shock of life through her frozen core. Her hands still trembled. "Why?" she asked, her voice a little stronger. "Why did they help me?" Calder leaned back against the stone wall, the firelight dancing in his amber eyes. "Because I asked them to." Maeve frowned, confused. You trained them? Wolves?" A small, wry smile touched his lips. "Not trained?" he corrected gently. "Trusted." As if summoned by the word, the gray wolf, Bram, rose from his spot by the entrance. He padded silently across the floor, his claws making no sound on the stone, and lay down beside Maeve's legs. She tensed, a primal jolt of fear shooting through her, but Calder just gave a slight nod. "That one's Bram. Around here, he's the one who decides who lives and who dies." Maeve stared at the magnificent creature at her feet. Bram let out a soft huff of air and closed his eyes. It wasn't the posture of sleep, but of a deep and settled peace. He had accepted her. For now. "I have nowhere to go," she said, the confession so quiet it was nearly swallowed by the fire's crackle. Calder was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. The cabin was filled with the sound of the wind, the fire, and the soft breathing of the wolves. Finally, he looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Then this is where you'll stay," he said, "until your feet work again. Or your heart does." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The other wolves shifted, settling deeper into their slumber. And for the first time since she was dragged by her hair from her father's porch, Maeve felt a flicker of something she thought she had lost forever. It wasn't happiness, not yet. But it was something like safety. A raw, strange, and wild kind of safety, but it was real. And in the heart of the unforgiving mountains, surrounded by wolves and a man as wild as they were, it was more than enough. But as the warmth of the cabin seeped into her, a new, cold dread began to form. Why would this man, this stranger, rescue her? What did he and his silent, watchful pack truly want from her? By the next afternoon, the strength had started to return to Maeve's limbs. She could stand, albeit shakily, her muscles screaming in protest. Calder said nothing as she tried to help him gather firewood, her legs buckling twice, sending her sprawling into the soft snow. He didn't mock her or rush to her aid. He simply found a long, sturdy branch, handed it to her to use as a walking stick, and pointed toward a rocky slope where dry pine limbs were sheltered from the worst of the weather. The wolves went with her. It was the strangest procession she could ever have imagined. Bram walked a few paces ahead, his great head held high, testing the wind. Two others flanked her, never crowding her, but always present, their silent forms moving with a liquid grace through the drifts. It should have been terrifying, being surrounded by such powerful predators, but it wasn't. There was a quiet reverence in their presence, a silent promise in the way they never let her fall too far behind or wander too close to a treacherous drop. Calder watched from the cliffside above the shelter, his arms crossed over his broad chest. He was always near, a silent, watchful presence, but he never hovered. He was giving her space to find her own feet, her own strength. Near a large, snow-dusted stump, the grief and the shock of the past day finally overwhelmed her. She dropped to her knees, the walking stick falling from her numb fingers, and buried her face in her hands. The sobs came in great ragged waves, shaking her entire body. She didn't hear the wolf approach. She only felt a sudden gentle pressure, a wet nose nudging her shoulder. She looked up into the intelligent yellow eyes of one of the younger wolves. It didn't whine or bark. It just stood there, offering a silent, solid comfort. No words, no questions, just presence. And it was exactly what she needed. That evening, as the rich, savory scent of a root stew filled the small cabin, Maeve finally found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her mind. "Why are you really out here, Calder?" she asked, her voice quiet. "You live like you're hiding from something." He didn't stop stirring the pot. For a long moment, the only sound was the scrape of the wooden spoon against the iron. "Maybe I am," he said at last, his voice low. "Maybe the world out there decided it didn't want me anymore. Or maybe," he paused, his gaze distant, "maybe I stopped wanting it first." Maeve opened her mouth to press him further, then closed it. In a way she couldn't explain, she understood. She knew what it was like to be cast out, to have the world you knew turn its back on you. The night grew colder, the wind howling a mournful song through the mountain passes. Calder was methodical in his preparations. He sealed a few cracks in the stone wall with a thick pine tar and set extra stones near the fire to heat, later placing them under their bedding of boughs and furs to radiate warmth through the night. When Maeve curled up by the fire, exhausted but finally feeling safe, she found a piece of soft, tanned leather folded neatly beside her. It was for her, she realized, to mend the torn hem of her dress. She glanced over at Calder, but he had already turned in for the night, his powerful frame a silhouette against the flickering flames, the wolves arranged around him like a living wall. She slept, but it was a restless, dream-filled sleep. She dreamt of falling, of the icy wind and her brother's cold faces. But when she finally jolted awake, it wasn't a nightmare that had disturbed her. It was a feeling, a deep, primal sense that something was wrong. Calder was gone. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, and his bed of furs was empty. The wolves were awake. Every single one of them. They weren't sleeping. They were alert, their bodies tense, their ears pricked. Bram was pacing near the entrance, a low, guttural growl rumbling in his chest as he sniffed at the cold air. Maeve scrambled up, pulling the heavy wolf hide around her shoulders, and stumbled toward the door. She pushed aside the thick fur that covered the entrance and stepped out into the pre-dawn gloom. Snow had started falling again, just light, silent flurries, but it was enough to lay a fresh, clean blanket over the world. Her eyes scanned the trail leading away from the shelter. She saw Calder's tracks, the deep imprints of his boots heading east, toward the ridge, but her breath caught in her throat when she saw the other set. They weren't Calder's. They weren't hers. They were small, and they were bare. Human footprints in the freezing snow. They had come from the direction of the ridge, circled the entire shelter, and stopped just behind the stack of firewood she had helped gather. She knelt, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. The snow was too fresh. This wasn't old. Whoever it was, whatever it was, had been here while they slept. watching them. Bram let out another low, threatening growl. Minutes later, which felt like an eternity, Calder returned. He moved silently through the trees, a brace of rabbits slung over his shoulder. He saw her kneeling in the snow, and his face hardened. She didn't have to speak. She just pointed at the impossible footprints. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "Those ain't mine," he muttered, his eyes scanning the surrounding woods. He looked at her. "And they ain't yours?" Maeve stood frozen, the cold she felt having nothing to do with the temperature. "Then whose are they?" Calder didn't answer. He just stared into the dark, silent trees, his hand resting on the hilt of the knife at his belt. "We'll find out by morning," he said, his voice grim. "Or they'll come back first." And as he spoke, the wolves sat up in perfect, tense silence, their glowing eyes fixed on the darkness, watching and waiting for the thing that walked barefoot in the snow. The night was no longer a refuge. It was a hunting ground. And they were no longer just survivors. They were the prey. Sleep was an impossibility. Maeve sat huddled by the fire, the heavy wolf hide pulled tight around her, but a chill deeper than any winter wind had settled in her bones. She kept glancing at the entrance, expecting to see a figure emerge from the darkness, a face to match the bare, silent footprints in the snow. Neither Calder nor the wolves rested. The pack formed a silent, living ring around the shelter, their bodies as still as statues, their unnerving, intelligent eyes fixed on the impenetrable blackness of the forest. They sensed a threat that Maeve could only imagine, a danger that slunk through the night on silent, naked feet. Calder sat on his stool, a long rifle resting across his lap. He didn't pace or fidget. He just sat, his presence a solid, reassuring weight in the terrifying stillness. He seemed to be waiting for something, for a signal only he and the wolves would understand. Dawn finally broke, not with a burst of color, but with a slow, gray leaking of light into the world. The snow had stopped, leaving everything pristine and white. Calder didn't speak. He simply rose, looked at Bram, and gave a single, sharp nod. It was all the command the wolf needed. Bram was a gray blur as he shot from the shelter, a silent predator unleashed. Two other wolves followed him instantly, their powerful bodies weaving through the deep snowdrifts with an uncanny, ghostly silence. Maeve stood by the doorway, her heart a tight, painful knot in her chest. "They'll lead us to it?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Calder pulled on his heavy fur cloak. "If it left a scent, they'll find it," he said grimly. They followed at a distance, Calder breaking the trail, Maeve close behind. The last two wolves from the pack refused to leave her side, flanking her like loyal guards, their heads constantly swiveling, scanning the trees. The mysterious tracks from the night before were partially filled with fresh snow, but their shape was still unmistakable. Small, bare feet, with a staggered, uneven gait, as if the person had been limping or trying to move with extreme stealth. The path they had taken was chilling. They hadn't just passed by. They had circled the camp, observing from every angle, watching them sleep. A shiver traced its way down Maeve's spine. Could it be a child? She wondered aloud. A lost child, alone in this wilderness? Calder didn't answer right away. He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "Not one from around here," he said at last, his tone heavy. The tracks led them up the ridge, then vanished abruptly under the heavy boughs of a fallen pine tree. It was a dead end. But the wolves didn't stop. They circled the area, their noses twitching, sniffing at the air, and then, as one, they darted north. They weren't following the tracks anymore. They were following a scent, one that led away from the relatively sheltered ridge and toward the deeper, more treacherous cliffs. Calder's face changed as he saw where they were going. A dark, troubled look crossed his features. He stopped walking so suddenly that Maeve almost ran into him. "There's nothing out there," he said, his voice low and strained. Just ice and wind. Nothing survives there. Maeve stood her ground. But the wolves are going. Calder looked at her, his amber eyes filled with a conflict she couldn't decipher. It was as if he was debating not just their next move, but some older, deeper struggle within himself. He let out a curse under his breath and plunged after the wolves without another word. The ground fell away sharply, curving toward a windswept ledge where the gale had scoured the snow right down to the bare black rock. Bram stood there, perfectly still, his head lowered. One of his massive paws was pressed against a smooth slab of ice near the base of a sheer stone wall. At first, it looked like nothing, just rock and wind-polished ice. But then Maeve saw it, a crack in the rock face, barely an inch wide, almost invisible, and beside it, a small dark smudge, something red. She hurried forward and knelt, her fingers hesitating before touching the stain. Blood, dried and smeared into the porous stone. Calder crouched beside her, his expression grim. "Someone crawled in," he muttered, his gloved fingers tracing the narrow crack. "Or was dragged." He stood up abruptly and began kicking at the snowbank with his heavy boots, clearing away the drift to expose the full entrance. It was a narrow, dark fissure in the mountain, but it was just big enough for a person to squeeze through. "Stay here," he commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "I'm not staying here," Maeve said. The words came out stronger than she expected, surprising even herself. The thought of waiting alone, not knowing what was inside that dark hole, was more terrifying than facing it with him. Calder studied her for a long, silent moment. He saw the fear in her eyes, but he also saw something else, a steely resolve that hadn't been there 2 days ago. He gave a single, curt nod. Together, they ducked into the fissure, Bram following so closely behind that Maeve could feel the heat from his body. The moment they were inside, the air changed. It was still cold, but the wind was gone. The silence was absolute. Just a few feet into the tunnel, the wolves stopped dead. Their ears went flat against their heads, and a low, uneasy whine came from the back of Bram's throat. And there, in the faint, gray light that filtered through cracks in the ceiling, Maeve saw it. A bundle, wrapped in tattered cloth, lying on the stone floor. It was so still, so small, she thought it was just a discarded pack. Or a body. But then it moved. A tiny, almost imperceptible shift. A sound, like a sigh. Maeve gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. That's a baby." Calder's voice was a horrified whisper beside her. No, not just a baby. That's what the tracks were guarding. The space was little more than a hollowed-out scar in the cliff wall, a natural tomb barely tall enough for a person to crawl into. The cold of the mountain seeped through the stone, a damp, penetrating chill that felt ancient and malevolent. But the wolves, Calder's wolves, had done something extraordinary. They had padded the floor of the small cavern with dry leaves and clumps of fur, some of it clearly from old kills, but some of it, Maeve realized with a jolt, had been torn from their own thick coats to create a nest. And in the center of that nest lay the infant. She was wrapped in a thick, tattered quilt that looked ancient, its patterns faded and its edges frayed. Maeve moved forward, her every instinct screaming to snatch the child up, to hold it, to warm it. But Calder's hand shot out, his grip firm on her arm. "Let her come to you," he whispered, his eyes not on the baby, but on something else. Curled beside the infant's legs, looking impossibly small and fierce, was a wolf pup. It couldn't have been more than a few months old. As Maeve leaned closer, the pup bared its tiny, needle-sharp teeth and let out a pitiful, squeaking growl. Then, as if realizing its own inadequacy, it whimpered and nudged the swaddled baby closer to Maeve's outstretched hands with its nose. Calder watched, his jaw clenched so tight a muscle jumped in his cheek. That pup, he breathed. It hasn't left her side. She's theirs. A lump formed in Maeve's throat. She knelt slowly, carefully, and eased the child into her arms. The baby was impossibly light, so fragile it felt as if she might break. She was maybe 6 months old, her skin pale and waxy, her lips chapped and blue-tinged from the cold. But she was warm. Feverish, maybe, but warm. As Maeve settled the infant against her chest, its eyes fluttered open. They were a deep, startling blue, and they were alive. They were seeing. "She's been fed," Maeve whispered in awe. Someone fed her. Calder didn't respond immediately. He was examining a small stone shelf just behind where the baby had been lying. A small tin cup had been wedged into a crack in the rock. It was half filled with what looked like goat's milk, frozen solid at the edges. Next to it was the charred, blackened stub of a candle. "She didn't get here alone," he said, his voice dangerously low. "And whoever brought her here, they meant to come back." Maeve clutched the child tighter, a fierce, protective instinct surging through her. "Then where are they now?" The silence that followed was heavy and cold, filled with unspoken, terrifying possibilities. Finally, Calder stood, his large frame filling the cramped space. "We're taking her back. She can't stay here another night." But as they turned to leave the tiny cavern, Bram moved. The great wolf blocked the narrow entrance, his body a solid wall of gray fur. His ears were flat against his skull, and a low, menacing growl rumbled deep in his chest. But he wasn't looking at them. He was looking past them, at something beyond the opening, out in the snow. Calder crouched low, his hand instantly going to the knife at his belt. His voice was a harsh, urgent whisper. "Go. Now." Maeve didn't hesitate. She clutched the baby tight against her body and scrambled backward out of the rock fissure, just as the wind outside shifted, carrying a new sound with it. A crunch in the snow. It wasn't the soft pad of a wolf's paw. It wasn't the heavy scrape of a bear. It was the distinct, solid sound of a heavy boot. A moment later, Calder emerged from the fissure, his rifle now in his hands, raised and ready. His expression was as hard and unforgiving as the mountain itself. The rest of the wolves had materialized from the storm, forming a silent, bristling wall around Maeve, shielding her and the child she held. Calder's voice was unnervingly calm, but it carried a deadly weight. "If you've come for her," he called out into the swirling snow, "you'd better think twice." A shadow detached itself from the trees, a figure tall and ragged. For a heart-stopping second it stood there, a dark shape against the white. Then it turned and fled, disappearing back into the forest as silently as it had appeared. Bram didn't give chase. He stayed put, a low growl still vibrating in his chest. So did the others. Calder slowly lowered the rifle, his eyes scanning the empty tree line. "They were watching us," he said, his breath pluming in the cold air. "All night." Maeve couldn't take her eyes off the baby in her arms, whose blue eyes were now wide open, staring up at her with an unnerving intensity. "She's not just a secret," Maeve said softly, a terrible understanding dawning on her. "She's a message." Calder nodded slowly, his gaze still fixed on the horizon, where their unseen watcher had vanished. "Then we'd better start listening close," he said, "because whatever brought her here, it isn't finished yet." The cabin felt different when they returned. Smaller, somehow, more vulnerable. The cracked beams, the scorched hearth, Maeve saw every flaw, every place where loneliness had seeped in like mold. But as she carried the tiny infant through the door, it felt less like a refuge and more like a fortress, a sacred ground they now had to defend. Bram entered first, his nose twitching, giving the small space a thorough inspection before he seemed satisfied. He padded over to the hearth and settled down, his amber eyes never leaving the child. The little pup, the one who had stood guard in the cave, immediately scrambled onto Maeve's lap the moment she sat down, curling into a tight, trembling ball. Calder moved with a focused, urgent energy, all traces of the quiet trapper gone. He was a man preparing for a war. He built the fire up until it roared, casting dancing, distorted shadows on the stone walls. While the cabin filled with warmth, he went to a loose floorboard Maeve had never noticed before and pulled it up. From the dark space beneath, he retrieved a rolled-up map, yellowed with age, and spread it across the small, rough table. Maeve watched him from across the room, rocking the baby gently in her arms. "What are you looking for?" "Answers," he said, his voice tight. "And maybe a name." His finger, scarred and calloused, traced a series of faint lines on the map. Old trapping routes run through these ridges. They've been abandoned for years, but I've seen signs. Tracks where there shouldn't be any. Smoke on the horizon when I was the only soul for 100 miles. They're not Lakota, not settlers from the towns. He looked up, his eyes dark with a grim certainty. Mountain men, or something like them, maybe just one. The baby in Maeve's arms began to stir, her tiny lips moving. She wasn't crying. She was making a sound, a soft coo, as if she were testing her own voice for the first time. Calder turned, his attention snagged by the sound. "That child is not here by accident, Maeve. You saw the wolves. They didn't just protect her." He leaned forward, his voice dropping. "They delivered her." Maeve looked down at the infant, her heart pounding a heavy, slow rhythm. "To us?" "No," he said softly, his gaze intense. "To you." Before Maeve could even begin to process the weight of his words, the baby's tiny fingers curled into the collar of her dress. The baby looked straight into her eyes, and the sound she made this time wasn't a whimper or a coo. It was a word, a single, perfectly formed word. "Mama." Maeve's breath hitched in her throat. Calder froze, the map forgotten. The world seemed to stop. The fire didn't crackle, the wind didn't howl, the wolves didn't breathe. For one single crystalline moment, the entire mountain held its breath. Did you hear that?" Maeve whispered, her voice trembling. Calder nodded slowly, his expression a mixture of awe and something that looked terrifyingly like fear. "She knows you." He took a step closer. "But how? How is that possible?" "Because you were meant to find her," a voice said. But it wasn't Calder's voice. It was his, but different, deeper, and it came from a place of memory, a place of pain. He looked at her, and for the first time she saw past the hermit, past the warrior. She saw a man shattered by grief. His eyes were fixed on her, not with hunger or pity, but with a raw, soul-deep reverence. "I've been waiting," he said, the words so soft she almost didn't hear them. "For what?" she asked, her own voice a whisper. His voice cracked, the sound of a heart breaking all over again. "For something to believe in again." A sharp, sudden sound shattered the fragile moment. Knock. It wasn't a frantic pounding. It was a single, deliberate, bone-chilling tap on the wooden door. In an instant, the wolves were on their feet, a silent, bristling phalanx of fur and teeth. Bram let out a low, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards. Maeve stood up slowly, pressing the baby, who had started to cry, against her chest. Calder grabbed his rifle, moved to the door, and wrenched it open, ready to face whatever was on the other side. There was no one. Nothing but the swirling snow and the deepening twilight. And then something small and dark dropped from the porch railing, landing silently in the fresh snow. A carving. A small, crudely whittled wolf, fashioned from dark wood. Its teeth were bared in a silent snarl, and its eyes had been burned black with soot. Calder bent down and picked it up, turning it over in his hand. Behind them, inside the cabin, Bram began to growl again. Not at the carving, but at the dark, watching woods beyond. "They're not finished," Maeve whispered, a cold dread washing over her. Calder's hand tightened around the wooden wolf, his knuckles white. "No," he said, his voice like flint, "but neither are we." They found the mark when Calder was gently changing the baby's soiled wrappings with strips of clean, soft linen. It was faint, almost invisible against the child's pale skin, but it was there, an ashen smear, shaped like a perfect crescent moon, just below the arch of her tiny right foot. Maeve reached out and touched it, thinking at first that it was just a smudge of dirt or soot from the hearth. But the mark didn't wipe away. It was stained into the skin itself. Calder leaned in closer, his face darkening as he saw it. "That's not a birthmark," he murmured, his voice grim. "What is it then?" Maeve asked, her stomach twisting into a cold knot. "It's ritual," he said, and the word hung in the air like a death sentence. Maeve stared at him, bewildered. "What kind of ritual puts ash on a child's foot?" Calder's jaw worked slowly, as if he were chewing on broken glass. "Not the kind you come back from." He stood up and began to pace the small cabin, his heavy boots thudding on the floorboards. "Years ago," he began, his voice low and strained, "when I first came to these mountains, the old trappers would whisper stories about a ridge cult, men who'd gone too long without people, too long in the dark and the cold, men who started listening to the whispers on the wind and believing they were gods." He stopped and looked at the baby, his eyes filled with a terrible pity. They didn't bury their dead like normal folk. They believed the mountain claimed the body, but the spirit needed to be anchored. So they marked their chosen children with the ash of a sacred fire. They said it bound the child's spirit to the earth, a sacrifice to appease the cold gods of winter. Maeve shivered, pulling the baby closer, as if her own body could shield the child from this madness. Then why is she alive? Why would they let her live? Calder's voice dropped to a near whisper, heavy with horrifying implication. What if they didn't? What if she wasn't supposed to survive the ritual? Maeve's gaze darted to the wolves. The little pup had once again curled up beside the infant, a tiny, furry guardian. Bram sat like a stone sentry at the door, his gaze fixed on the wilderness outside. "Then why did your wolves protect her?" Calder stopped his pacing and stood over the map on the table, his hands braced against the wood. "Because something went wrong in their plan," he said, his voice gaining a hard, determined edge. "And right in ours." He began pulling out more items from beneath the floorboards, old leather-bound journals filled with spidery script, more detailed maps of the region, a hand-carved knife with a blade made of sharpened bone. "This isn't just some abandoned infant, Maeve," he said, his eyes burning with a new fire. "This is a rescue, and we're standing right in the middle of it." As if the mountain itself was listening, the wind outside began to howl, shrieking around the corners of the cabin like a hungry beast. Maeve swaddled the baby tighter in the old quilt, her heart pounding in time with the storm. Then came the knock, knock, knock. Faster this time, more urgent, more demanding. Calder didn't hesitate. He grabbed the rifle, flung the door open, and aimed it into the swirling snow, prepared for a fight. But again, there was nothing. No one. Just the wind and the white. "Calder, look!" Maeve gasped. In the center of the porch, drawn in the same black soot as the wolf carving's eyes, was a perfect circle. And in the middle of that circle lay a scrap of cloth. It was torn, and it was stained with a dark, frozen blotch of blood. Calder stepped cautiously onto the porch and lifted it with the barrel of his rifle. It wasn't just a scrap of cloth. It was fine, delicate lace, a piece torn from a wedding veil. Maeve's voice cracked. "This is a warning." "No," Calder said, his jaw set like granite as he stared out into the storm. "It's an invitation." Maeve looked at him, startled and confused. "An invitation? To what?" "To come get her back." From inside the cabin, Bram let out a deep, rumbling growl, and the little pup barked once, a sharp, frightened sound. Calder turned back to Maeve, his eyes blazing with a fierce protective light. They know she's still alive, and they're calling us out into the storm. Maeve touched the crescent mark on the child's foot again, then looked up at Calder, her own fear solidifying into a cold, hard resolve. We can't just wait for them to come here. We can't leave her unguarded. We won't, Calder said, his voice a low, dangerous promise. We're going to find out where this madness started, and we're going to finish it. Maeve gave a slow, deliberate nod. Something inside her chest had shifted. The terror was still there, but it was now overshadowed by a powerful, unyielding determination. Then we'll follow the ridge, she said, her voice steady. Calder glanced at the map on the table, then out at the rising blizzard. The world outside was a white, howling chaos. And if we're not back by dawn, he started to say. Maeve didn't blink. We'll be back. And before either of them took another step, the wolves moved toward the door, their bodies tense and ready. It was as if they had heard the same unspoken oath and had already accepted their part in the war to come. The higher they climbed, the more the wind howled, tearing at them with invisible claws. It was a physical assault, a relentless battery of ice and air that stole their breath and numbed their faces. Calder forged ahead, his powerful frame a dark shape against the swirling white, the rifle slung across his back. The snow was already up to his knees, each step a monumental effort. Maeve followed in his tracks, the baby wrapped tight in her sling, secured against her chest. The child was a small, warm weight against her heart, a silent, precious reason for every agonizing step. She kept one hand on Bram's thick, coarse fur, using the great wolf's steady presence as an anchor in the storm. The little pup, refusing to be left behind, darted around them in quick, anxious loops, whining softly, as if it could sense the darkness they were walking toward. They followed the treacherous ridgeline until the trees thinned out, their gnarled branches reaching like skeletal fingers into the gray sky. They were approaching the very edge of the cliff where Maeve's brothers had left her for dead. It was Calder who stopped first, holding up a gloved hand, his body suddenly tense. There, he said, his voice barely audible over the shriek of the wind. He was pointing down toward a shallow basin just below the bluff. There, half buried in snowdrifts and tangled branches, was a ring of stones, blackened and scorched by countless fires. And in the center of the ring, something pale and white stuck out of the snow. Bones. Not animal bones. They were too long, too slender, human. Maeve's breath caught in her throat, a sharp, painful gasp. They burned someone here. Calder nodded grimly, his face a mask of stone. Not recently, he said, his eyes scanning the desolate sight. But this isn't what I expected. He carefully made his way down the slippery incline, and Maeve followed, her boots sinking deep into the powder. He began to brush away the snow from the area around the fire pit, and what he uncovered was deeply disturbing. Small, crude carvings, dozens of them, littered the ground. They depicted wolves, gaunt-faced women, and small, stick-figure children. All of them were faceless. "This is a shrine," Maeve whispered, a profound sense of dread washing over her. Calder's face was pale beneath his wind-burnt skin. "Or a graveyard," he corrected. Suddenly, Bram let out a low, guttural growl, his head snapping toward a thicket of dead brush beyond the stone circle. The little pup, emboldened by the alpha's reaction, shot ahead, barking furiously. Driven by an instinct she couldn't explain, Maeve followed, pushing her way through the frozen, brittle branches until her boot kicked something hard and solid beneath the snow. Wood. She dropped to her knees and began digging with her bare hands, ignoring the biting cold. "Calder!" she called, her voice thin and tight with a new kind of fear. "Help me." He was there in an instant. Together they cleared the snow away, revealing a shallow, crudely made wooden box. It had been buried here, a tiny makeshift coffin. Calder used the butt of his rifle to pry the frozen lid open. Inside, there was no body, just a thick layer of ash and another child-sized shawl, this one embroidered with the same symbol of a snarling wolf that was carved into the stones of the shrine. And beneath the ash, nestled in the center of the box, was a necklace, a single large wolf's tooth hanging from a leather cord. Calder's voice was as brittle as ice when he spoke. This belonged to someone important, a chieftain of their madness. Maeve stared at the necklace, her mind racing, the pieces of the puzzle clicking into place with horrifying clarity. The wolves hadn't just been guarding the baby. They had been trying to show them something, to lead them here. They buried this, she breathed. They buried him, the one who led them. Calder looked from the necklace in the box back to the baby strapped to Maeve's chest. A look of dawning, terrible understanding crossed his face. And now, he said slowly, they've chosen someone else. Maeve blinked, her heart stopping. Me? No, Calder said, his voice barely a whisper. Her. As if on cue, the little pup, standing over the open box, tilted its head back and let out a howl. It wasn't a frightened, anxious sound this time. It was a full, round, surprisingly deep howl. A declaration. Calder turned and looked back up the ridge, toward the higher peaks that were shrouded in mist and storm. They're not warning us anymore, he said, his voice filled with a strange new awe. They're guiding us. Maeve slowly got to her feet, the fine snow clinging to her skirts. Then where to next? Calder pointed down into a deep, dark ravine that split the mountain in two. There's a cave system 2 miles that way. Old, deep. If there's anyone left of this cult, any of them still watching us, they'll be there. Maeve looked down at the baby in her sling. The infant stirred, awakened by the cold and the howling pup. She opened her eyes and looked up at Maeve. They were clear, wide, and impossibly aware. There was no fear in them. She's not afraid, Maeve whispered. Calder met her gaze, and in his eyes, she saw her own fear being burned away by a fierce, undeniable resolve. Then we shouldn't be either. Without another word, the wolves moved forward, leading the way. They broke a new trail, plunging down into the ravine, heading directly for the dark, gaping mouth of the mountain. It didn't feel like walking into a cave. It felt like walking into the mouth of some great, sleeping beast. A blast of cold, stale air rushed out to meet them as they stood at the entrance, a silent, subterranean exhale. Their pine knot torches sputtered and hissed, the flickering flames barely managing to pierce the oppressive, absolute darkness within. Calder went in first, the rifle held at the ready, his broad shoulders filling the narrow opening. Maeve followed a step behind, one hand clutching the sling that held the baby tight against her chest, the other resting on Bram's back. The great wolf and the little pup flanked them, moving with a tense, silent stealth, their claws clicking softly on the stone floor. The walls of the cavern were slick with a cold, greasy moisture, and as they moved deeper, Maeve saw that they were covered in strange symbols. They had been etched into the rock with something sharp, crude, spidery markings just below head height. She recognized them with a jolt of fear. They were the same symbols embroidered on the shawl they'd found buried on the ridge, the same pattern on the quilt the baby had been wrapped in. These aren't just drawings, Calder muttered, holding his torch higher to examine a particularly intricate cluster of markings. They're instructions, a creed. The main passage suddenly split, branching into 2 equally dark and uninviting tunnels. The wolves hesitated, stopping at the fork. Bram let out a low, uneasy growl, his nose twitching as he tested the air from each passage. Then, with a decisive snuff, he turned and padded down the left-hand tunnel. Maeve followed without question. Her trust in these creatures was now absolute, a primal instinct that overrode all logic. The tunnel took them deeper and deeper into the mountain's core. The air grew thin and heavy, and the silence became a physical pressure against their eardrums. It was a dead, ancient silence, the kind that feels like it has been undisturbed for 1,000 years. And then a sound shattered it, a howl. But it didn't come from Bram or the pup. It came from the darkness ahead. It was a human sound, but twisted, filled with an agony so profound it was barely recognizable as human. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. Maeve froze, her blood turning to ice. Calder raised his torch high, his face a grim mask in the flickering light, and stepped through a narrow opening into a large central chamber. And what they saw stole the breath from their lungs. In the center of the chamber was a circle of scorched rocks, the remnants of a great fire. And kneeling around the extinguished fire pit were 5 figures, cloaked in black, rotting furs. They were perfectly still, their heads bowed in a posture of grim prayer. They didn't move. They didn't even flinch as the torchlight washed over them. One of them, a gaunt man with a long, matted beard, still clutched the hilt of a rusty knife, its blade buried deep in his own chest. His blood had frozen into a black, crystalline cascade down his furs. Another figure, a woman, had her arms folded across a small bundle. Maeve first thought it was another child, but as the light caught it, she saw it was just a pile of bones, bleached white and carefully arranged. Maeve gripped Calder's arm, her knuckles white. "They're dead," she whispered, her voice choked with horror. "All of them." Calder nodded slowly, his eyes sweeping across the grim tableau. But not for long. They came here to die, together. "A ritual?" she asked. "Redemption?" he countered, his voice low. "Or silence?" At the far end of the chamber, something glinted in the torchlight. A small wooden cradle, intricately carved with the same faceless figures from the shrine. It was empty, save for one single object resting on the small pillow inside. A child's bracelet woven from sinew and tiny colored beads. The clasp was a piece of carved bone, etched with the same crescent ash mark that was on the baby's foot. Maeve walked toward it, as if in a trance, and picked it up. It was so small, so delicate. "She was theirs," she whispered, the terrible truth settling over her like a shroud. "She was their child, and they let her go." Calder came to stand beside her, his gaze sweeping from the cradle to the dead cultists, and finally to the living, breathing child nestled against Maeve's chest. "No," he said softly. "They didn't let her go. They gave her up. They sacrificed themselves so she would have a chance to be raised without all this." Maeve looked at the circle of the dead, at the wolves who had so mysteriously led them to this place, and then down at the baby in her arms, who was staring at the bracelet in Maeve's hand, with wide, curious eyes. "Then why the warnings?" she asked, her mind struggling to reconcile the horrific scene with the desperate act of love it represented. The bloody veil on the porch? The watcher in the snow? Calder's voice was quiet, filled with a sudden profound sadness. Because maybe they weren't all ready to let go. Maeve's chest ached with a sorrow so deep it was almost unbearable. But now, the wolves, who had hung back at the entrance to the chamber, now padded forward. Their bodies were no longer tense. Their heads were low, but not in fear. It was a look of reverence, of finality. The baby blinked, then reached out a tiny, perfect hand, her fingers stretching toward the flickering torchlight. The flames didn't waver, they burned steady and bright. Maeve's voice, when she spoke, was no longer trembling. It was as solid as the mountain around them. "Now it's over." Calder looked at her, then at the child, and a slow nod was his only reply. "And she's ours." They turned their backs on the tomb and walked back through the silent, dark passages of the cave. The silence followed them, not as a threat, but as a final, peaceful breath. As they emerged from the cave's mouth, stepping back out into the world of snow and light, the storm had broken. The wolves moved with a new, calm grace, no longer guarding, but escorting their new, precious charge. Behind them, the mountain seemed to seal itself in silence once more, and ahead, the wind carried no threats, no warnings, only the clean, cold scent of pine and the promise of a new day. By the time they trudged the last few yards back to the cabin, the world had been transformed. The blizzard had passed, and a profound quiet had settled over the mountains. The sky was a vast silver canvas, and every tree, every rock, was outlined in a delicate layer of soft frost. The landscape was clean, pure, and still. Every footprint they had made on their desperate journey out had already been erased by the fresh snow, as if the mountain itself had wiped the slate clean. Maeve stepped onto the porch first. Her arms ached with a deep, bone-weary exhaustion, but they were also full. The baby, nestled warm and safe against her chest, hadn't made a sound since they left the cave. Not a cry, not a coo. She had simply watched the world with that wide, steady, unnervingly intelligent gaze, as if she had witnessed the same deaths, the same madness, and had already made a conscious choice to live a different kind of life. Calder paused at the edge of the clearing. He stood for a long moment, watching the tree line where the wolves, Bram, the pup, and the others, had gathered in a silent, formal line. But this time, they did not growl. They did not pace. One by one, starting with Bram, they lowered their great heads in a gesture that was unmistakably a bow. Then, as one, they turned and melted back into the forest, disappearing into the legend from whence they came. Only the little pup lingered, letting out a soft, questioning whine. Bram reappeared for a second at the edge of the trees, nudging the pup with his snout, a gentle but firm command. The pup gave one last look at the cabin, at Maeve and the baby, and then it too turned and followed its pack into the deep woods. "Will they come back?" Maeve whispered, a strange sense of loss mingling with her relief. Calder came to stand beside her on the porch. "Not unless they're needed," he said, his voice quiet. "Wolves don't waste themselves on the past." Maeve swallowed the lump in her throat. "Neither should we." Inside, the fire in the hearth was still smoldering, a bed of defiant red embers. Calder added fresh logs, and the flames caught quickly, leaping up with a cheerful crackle, filling the small cabin with light and life. He didn't rest. He went straight to the window that had been broken in some long-ago struggle and began hammering new planks into place, sealing out the cold, sealing them in. Maeve sat in the rocking chair by the fire, rocking the child gently, studying her perfect, sleeping face in the warm glow. "We need to name her," she said softly. Calder didn't pause in his work, but his voice was soft when he replied. "Neva." Maeve looked over at him. "Neva?" "It's an old word," he said, hammering a final nail into place. "It means snow. She survived it, and she'll never have to fear it again." Maeve nodded, a slow smile spreading across her face. "Neva," she whispered, trying the name out. It fit. It was perfect. As if in response, the baby, Neva, let out a tiny yawn and snuggled deeper into her arms, her eyes closing in contented sleep. Maeve pressed her lips to the child's soft forehead. "You're safe now," she promised. "You're home." They worked in a comfortable, quiet partnership for the rest of the day. No more blood, no more veils, no more digging in frozen earth. Just the simple grounding tasks of building a life. That night, Maeve woke long before the dawn. She slipped out of her warm bed of furs and stepped onto the porch. The world was bathed in the ethereal light of a full moon, low and heavy in the sky. Not a sound stirred. But as her eyes adjusted to the silvered landscape, she saw something at the edge of the clearing, something that hadn't been there before. An object, stuck into the ground, like a strange, primitive marker. She walked toward it, her bare feet silent on the cold, packed snow, her breath visible in the frigid air. It was the necklace, the carved wolf's tooth on its leather cord, the one Calder had found in the buried box, the one they had left behind in the death cave. Now, it was hanging from a sharpened stick that had been planted firmly in the ground. And all around it, in the pristine snow, were tracks. Not human. Wolf tracks. Dozens of them, forming a wide protective circle around the entire cabin, a silent, invisible perimeter. None of them crossed the threshold. Maeve stood there for a long time, the cold seeping into her feet, a profound, overwhelming sense of gratitude washing over her. She slowly bent down, her hand hovering over the necklace but not touching it, and whispered to the silent, watching forest. "Thank you." A floorboard creaked behind her. Calder's voice came, quiet and low in the darkness. "What are they saying?" Maeve turned to face him, a real, genuine smile lighting up her face. Her heart felt steady and calm for the first time in an eternity. "They're saying she belongs here," Maeve said, "and that we do too. If you were moved by this story of survival and the unbreakable bonds of family, both human and wild, please don't forget to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more true-hearted stories from the untamed frontier. We have to ask, if a pack of wolves had appeared to you on the edge of a cliff, a silent invitation to an unknown fate, would you have run from them? Or would you have followed them into the storm? Let us know in the comments below,